Welcome to the Hindu editorial discussion. My name is Ryan Pinto and I'm going to discuss the editorials of December 7th. Today's focus will be on majorly we are going to speak on two topics. One is on international relations, that is international organization, that is on United Nations Alliance of Civilization, UNAOC. And the other topics that we are going to discuss is mostly on economics, like the current economic growth rate, the steps taken by the government, unorganized sector, etc. So, broadly, we can divide it into two, one on international organization and the second on economics. Let's continue with the editorial. So, the first editorial is culture and peace. Let's see the context why we are discussing this editorial. In the United Nations, India's stand against United Nations selectivity on religions gains force from its secularism. So, what has happened is at the UN General Assembly, discussing resolutions of the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, UNAOC, on the culture of peace, India criticized that the world body for what it had called selectivity in seeking to protect Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism over others. So, what has happened is in the United Nations General Assembly, discussion was going on the resolutions which was passed by UNAOC. Now, what is UNAOC? We are going to see later in the discussion. But they have, the UNAOC was brought in to bring peace, to bring in unity and friendship amongst the major religions and the civilization. But the problem is, India has said that United Nations AOC is mostly protecting or always selective in its criticism on attacks on Islam and Christianity and Judaism, but they have never spoken in strong words on attacks on Sikhs, Hindus, and Buddhists. So, this is the context. The Indian delegate pointed out that previous resolutions of the UNAOC dating back to 2006 had repeatedly decried the hatred against those religions. So, since 2006, UNAOC has always spoken about Islamophobia, Christianophobia, anti Semitism, but didn't condemn attacks on other religious groups like Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, etc., who have suffered terror strikes and seen their shrines destroyed in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So we had seen the shrines destroyed in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the minorities attacked over there who were mainly Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists. And at this time, the UNAOC has not taken any strong stand. UNGA statement welcomed the Kartarpur Gurudwara corridor agreement between India and Pakistan, but failed to know that Pakistan government has taken over the management of the Sikh shrine. So the Kartarpur Gurudwara, which we considered a major step by the Imran Khan government, the United Nations General Assembly was very happy and uh, they uh, they even spoke good about it. But the problem is Pakistan's government is taking the management of the Sikh shrine, and this is in contravention of the agreement and violation of the Sikh beliefs. But United Nations didn't speak anything about it. That's what India has charged. India's delegate also charged Pakistan of culture of hatred against religions in India and fostering cross-border terrorism. The United Nations selectivity under the aegis of UNAOC, an organization that was set up in 2005 to prevent polarization between societies and cultures and to bridge differences between them, only serves to further the theory of an inevitable clash of civilization. There was a theory of clash of civilization given earlier, and this UNAOC's stand of only protecting the Abrahamic religions. Abrahamic religions means Abraham is or was common between all the three religion, and United Nations Alliance of Civilization is only trying to protect these three religions, gives or it helps in the theory of clash of civilizations, which is very dangerous. New Delhi has been concerned by an increase in intrusive language from the UN bodies concerned as well. Given the UN AOC issued a statement of grave concern over the Delhi riots. United Nations Alliance of Civilization spoke about the Delhi riots this February, and it resulted in casualties of mostly Muslims. But what about the terrorism and deaths faced in Afghanistan and Pakistan by the other religion? India is keen to push back on the UN AOC and other UN arms like UNHRC, that is United Nations Human Rights Council, that have criticized the CAA. So, in context of India's side, you must remember Delhi riots and CAA, whereas another thing that you have to remember is Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists targeted in Afghanistan and Pakistan. On the other side, you must remember they are charging UNAOC to be supporting the Abrahamic religions. Now, something about the UNAOC, what UNAOC is, many a times asked in various government exams, and which we should be knowing since it's in news. The United Nations Alliance of Civilization was established in 2005. The political initiative of Mr. Kofi Annan, the then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, very famous, and co-sponsored by the governments of Spain and Turkey. In 2019, Mr. Miguel Angel Moratinos assumed the position of High Representative for the United Nations Alliance of Civilization. So, Mr. Miguel Angel Moratinos, 2019, he was the High Representative of the United Nations Alliance of Civilization. So, just remember Kofi Annan and Mr. Moratinos. The UN AOC High Representative Secretariat are based and operating from New York. So just remember UNAOC Secretariat and of the office and all are based and operated from New York. It is an initiative that seeks to galvanize. So why is this important? What is the objective? To galvanize international action against extremism through forging of international, intercultural and interreligious dialogue, so that it can bring peace, friendship, fraternity, etc. The UNAOC has condemned the beheading of a teacher. Recently, again, it was in news. It had condemned the beheading of a teacher in Paris. We had done the editorial earlier on the French teacher who was a history teacher. He was beheaded. The French teacher was killed after he taught freedom of speech and showed caricatures depicting the Islamic prophet Muhammad to his students. Okay, so just remember the UNAOC 2005, and it was under the political initiative of Kofi Annan. Today, Mr. Moratinos is the High Representative for the UNAOC, and also their objectives. So, conclusion is the CAA, for example, has been criticized for offering fast track citizenship to only a select group of religions, leaving out Muslims. India cannot call for a culture of peace that stitches together an alliance of faiths, while Indian states bring laws that seek to make difficult interfaith marriages. So, India on one side is asking for equality and taking into consideration the religions like Hinduism, Sikhism and Buddhism, etc. But on the other side, it is attacking they are bringing laws for the interfaith marriages, and the CAA also is very unequal for the Muslims in the countries where, like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. So bringing these laws and then talking about equality of the religion, so thus India needs to change some things there. The force of India's argument against United Nations selective resolution and non-inclusive language, as well as the international efforts of adversaries such as Pakistan, remains its own secular credentials enshrined in the constitution and its pluralistic ethos. So, if we want to condemn these things, we ourselves will need to follow what is there in our constitution. Secularism, which brings in the freedom of religion, etc., from Article 25 to Article 28. You have to remember all this. So, the next is on the RBI. Recently, we had the Monetary Policy Committee, which gave the report on the growth and what the reserve ratios and all will be. So let's see on the RBI. So first editorial was on the United Nations Alliance of Civilization. The Monetary Policy Committee. So we have seen the RBI has its Monetary Policy Committee, which discusses and brings out the you can say which dictates the interest rate and brings out the policy rates. So it's very important. The Monetary Policy Committee's policy of prioritizing growth over stability is clearly fraught with risk. We know RBI focuses on many things before it brings out its policy. Whenever the RBI brings the repo rate and the reverse repo rate, that is the reserve ratios, it focuses on inflation, growth, employment, then we have our exchange rate, etc. But the main focus should have been inflation. That was what was said also by the Urjit Patel committee earlier, 2-3 years back. The Monetary Policy Committee of Reserve Bank of India, to maintain status quo on benchmark interest rates and continue with accommodative policy stance for as long as necessary, has been widely welcomed as being pro-growth. So what happened is the committee came out with the report and it did not make any changes in the repo rates and the reserve repo rates, so that more loans can be given, there can be more business happening and the growth increases. But there is a problem. The MPC, that is Monetary Policy Committee, also flagged its expectation that inflation would continue to remain high through the coming months to average 6.3, well above the 6% average. So the MPC is given a target to look at the interest rate 2 to 6%. But the Monetary Policy Committee itself says the interest rate is going to be 6.3%. So the RBI's work is to control the inflation. But still it went towards growth. Seen in this slide, MPC's decision shows that RBI is clearly prioritizing growth over price stability for now. The compulsion to ensure that MPC remains broadly supportive of an economy that is in recession as a fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic and accompanying lockdown is understandable. The rate settings panels to shrug off both persistently high inflation and its own outlook on prices is a cause of concern. So it is understandable that the India's growth is not going to be as earlier. It's predicted to be minus 7.5% this year. But still, RBI needs to focus on what is worrying is it itself has said that the inflation will be 6.3% and it needs to also focus on inflation. So that's what the writer is saying. Recent increases in the price of iron ore, steel and transportation also adds to the worries. The RBI has also surprisingly raised its GDP forecast for the full year. So what the RBI has done is it has raised the focus on the GDP forecast for the full year. The central bank now expects the economy to shrink by only 7.5%. As I told you earlier, RBI said that it will increase, or sorry, reduce by 9.5%, but it is now looking better. It will reduce by only 7.5%. This forecast is predicated on a return to growth of 0.1% in quarter 3 and 0.7% in quarter 4. So recently in quarter 3 there was an increase. That's the growth happened rather than decline, and you must have known in the first quarter it was minus 23%. It is ostensibly sanguine outlook of on the economy. Ostensibly sanguine means it's a very hopeful, it's a very good news on the economy part. That is hard to square with the RBI stand according primacy to growth over price stability. With the central bank uh, prognosticating that save some possible continued softening in the prices of cereals and transient easing of vegetables through the winter, other food prices would persistently remain at elevated levels. So, in this, what you have to remember is, first of all, what RBI is showing about the economic growth is a very good picture. But the central bank has to remember, it itself has said that 6.3% is going to be the inflation. The food inflation is going to be high, except some uh, vegetables and fruits, which reduces during the winter. The others are going to remain high. So RBI needs to very carefully look at it. By laying the onus on supply disruptions, profiteering, and taxes for the inflation spiral, the RBI is abdicating its primary mandate. By saying that it is because the supply has disrupted, people have started because hoarding and profiteering, and taxes are high. That is why there is inflation. That is not the answer RBI needs to give. It should control the inflation. That's its primary mandate. So you have to remember, the first economics editorial that we saw is on the RBI and where it needs to focus on. The second is on the unorganized sector. So in India, we have a large number of unorganized sector working as vegetable vendors, carpenters, masons, and on the screen you have the washermen. Okay, so all these are part of the unorganized sector. Recently, the government has come up with the labor codes. Let's see if it helps the unorganized sector. A mirage sold as panacea for the unorganized sector. The labor codes will only better India's ease of doing business ranking instead of improving the conditions of employment. So, what the editorial is saying is, it will only help the ease of doing business, not the condition of the employment. The Union Labour Minister claims that the four labour codes would generate employment and secure the basic right of the workers. Earlier there were 44. Good thing is it is brought to 4, but we need to see how does it help the labor, because most of these labor codes is only helping the business class. He also claimed that the labor codes could seek to universalize the right to minimum wages of workers and social security entitlements. So, the two main things of the labor code, what the Union Labor Minister is saying, is minimum wages and social security. Let's see if it helps the unorganized sector. With even the Bharatiya Janata Party affiliated Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh opposing the codes, what are the reasons for this cold reception to what the BJP claims is a game changer for all the workers in the economy? Even BJP's affiliated Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh has opposed this code. But still, BJP claims it's a game changer. Let's see how. Universal social security, that it claims it will give benefits to the labor. The codes mandate benefits of employee state insurance and provident fund only for workers belonging to the establishments employing 10 workers or more. So it is compulsory if any organization is having 10 workers or more to give employee state insurance and provident fund. This means it leaves off 80% of all Indian workers, because most of these are in the informal sector. From the ambit of these benefits, like you can say the vegetable vendor or the washer person, or even our domestic help in the cities, they come all in the informal sector, and they don't come into this establishment. What about their insurance and provident fund? The most ubiquitous is where they have seen everywhere, we encounter in our daily life, that is our domestic help, street vendors, paper boy, are all left out of reckoning of this universal coverage. What does ESI coverage mean for the remaining 20% of the workers? So 80% is out of this ESI. Let's see what it means for the 20% of the workers. In 2016, the ESI covered 2.1 crore workers. This increased to 3.6 crore by March 2019. So that's a good sign. ESI employed around 6 doctors per 1 lakh beneficiaries in 2016, as against World Health Organization norm of 100 doctors. So even if you get the insurance, does the state have that much of facility to give it to them? You can see the numbers: 1 lakh, 6 doctors for per 1 lakh people. The proportion of doctors to beneficiaries would have further fallen with the expanded membership. In the interest of ease of doing business, the employer plus employee contribution to the ESI was reduced. So first of all, the doctors number are less, plus now the contribution has also reduced from 6.5 to 4%. Do you think with less money they will be able to take in more doctors and provide more infrastructure? That's a thought. The decision to reduce the contribution rate at a time when the need for ESI was to increase expenditure on a medical care surely appears counterintuitive. So what we are seeing is, the first, in the labor codes, the labor minister had said about the social security. Is it giving the social security that the people need, that the workers need? Remember, 2.1 crore to 3.6 crores, and there are plans to take it up to 10 crores. But the contribution has reduced from 6.5 to 4%. With the new code seeking to cover 20% of all workers, the membership would further increase to around 10 crores, a 3-time increase over the membership in 2019. The available capacity of the hospitals and dispensaries would be inadequate. The ESI coverage follows the map of industrial growth. So that's the first issue. Second is regional inequality. In industrial states like Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, the ESI covered around 20% of the population as beneficiaries in 2016. The corresponding figure was just 0.57% to Bihar. So the ESI just covered 20% in 2016 in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, whereas in Bihar it was just 0.7%. So that's another issue with the ESI. Surely the possibility of scaling up coverage is remote possibility in Bihar. The government also did away with a number of existing cess-based welfare schemes. So the first issue we saw was the infrastructure is less, the contribution is less now. There is a lot of regional inequality, and even the number of existing cess-based welfare schemes have been reduced. These included the BD Workers Welfare Board, covering an estimated 5 lakh home-based women workers. Even to this day, the older BD workers in the erstwhile South Kannada district of Madras Presidency credited the education schemes available to the board. So the BD Workers Welfare Board, had given a lot of education, health facilities, etc. because of these schemes. But now that also has been reduced and many are stopped. So which they say enabled their children to escape the pernicious bind of poverty. So that's the first claim on the welfare and social security. Second is minimum wage. Let's see what is the situation of the minimum wage. The second claim for universal coverage was for the minimum wage. According to the Union Labour Minister, at present only 30% of the workers get covered. At various instances, the Labour Minister announced a floor wage of 178 per day in 2019, and recently Finance Minister 202. This is little more than half the 375 per day which was recommended by the Labour Ministry's expert committee. So first is the problem is few people are getting the minimum wage, plus the minimum wage is also very less. And also the lower the poverty line, also lower than the family poverty line expenditure estimated by the government appointed Rangarajan committee. So the committees which had come earlier, one of the committee by the Labour Ministry had said rupees 375, the government is giving 202 as a floor pay. The floor wage should more aptly be called as below poverty line or BPL wage. It can only serve to pull down wages, far from shoring up the wage level. So this wages given by the government is actually just pulling down the whole prices, because the private will not give you more than this. These codes, so now what are the problems? We saw the two issues, one on the social security, second on the minimum wage. These codes, which also include measures restricting the union's right to strike and relax norms for factory closure, serve to improve the ease of doing business ranking. So the problem with this is union's right to strike is gone and the factory can close easily. This hurts the labor. It will just improve the ease of doing business. For the unorganized sector workers, the labor codes provide a similar story, a set of fairy tale promises that are nothing but a mirage. So just remember the two things on social security and the minimum wages, and remember the numbers or the facts. Next is true fiscal responsibility, again on economics. So economics, the first thing we saw was the MPC, so Monetary Policy Committee, and second on the labor code. Third is true fiscal responsibility. Slashing public expenditure amid a recession is a recipe for serious economic disaster. So the government is expecting the RBI to give more loans, but government should spend less. That is the problem. The GDP contracted by 23.9% in that quarter compared to the same previous year. However, there was no particular reason for assuming that we would see a contraction in the second quarter as well. But that is what we find now. Though the contraction has been less than both what was in the previous quarter and what several sources have forecast, at 7.5%, it is still significant. So there is a contraction. It is still minus 7.5%. So to pull up the demand, the government needs to put in money. Thus far, we have not had V-shaped recovery predicted by the government's economist. To assume a V-shaped recovery following the lifting of centre's lockdown would not have been wrong if output were determined entirely by the supply side under normal circumstances. Output would remain depressed so long as the lockdown prevented from taking place, but would spring back once these restrictions are removed. However, after they are lifted, we would return to a world in which output is determined by demand. So till the lockdown, yes, output was down, and there it was expected that output would increase once the lockdown is over. But for the output, supply is not important. Yeah, it is one of the important things. The more important part is demand. Without demand, why will the supply increase? This now introduces the possibility that output may not spring back, as investments may actually decline post the lockdown. It would happen if depressed output causes private investors to hold their plans for the future and contract expenditure. So if you notice, the investments are also low, and because the investments are low, the output is low, and the reason for the investment being low, because there is demand is not there. So we have seen the fiscal policy. It is of two types. One is government increasing the expenditure and reducing taxes, that is expansionary. And the second one is government reducing the expenditure and increase the taxes, that is contractionary. So when there is a decline in the output or the low GDP, the government follows the expansionary fiscal policy, and when there is inflation and uh, all these things, then the government follows contractionary fiscal policy. So you have to remember, the government had to spend more and put more taxes, less taxes, but the government is doing the reverse. So the last editorial, so first editorial was on alliance of civilizations, the other on economics, we saw on what the RBI is doing, then on the unorganized sector and fiscal policy of the government. Last one is telling figures. The NSO's press release makes speculation about investment behavior unnecessary. So we just spoke about output, demand, and also spoke about the investment. Let's see about the investment behavior. Three other sources of expenditure exist, namely exports, private consumption expenditure, and the government's final consumption expenditure. This can be related to the earlier editorial about government's investment. So this is actually a continuation of the government's investment. The Whenever we talk about GDP expenditure method, we talk about the government's investment. Okay, then we talk about the private expenditure. We talk about the exports minus imports and the private investments. So when these things are taken into consideration, what the article is saying, that is, we do not need to focus much on only government expenditure. There are other things also. There is exports, there is private consumption, and then there is government final consumption, etc. Why we need to focus on investments? The first to show a substantial increase over their quarter one, but the government final consumption expenditure actually declined by 25%. So exports, private final consumption expenditure shows an increase slightly, but government expenditure has reduced drastically, 25%. From the NSO statement, we can determine the extent of contraction that would have occurred had the government maintained its consumption expenditure into the second quarter of this financial year. So, looking at the NSO's number, we can say that if the government would have, rather than reducing, even maintained the expenditure, we would have just contracted by minus 4.1, but today our number is minus 7.5%. So, government needs to rethink. This reveals the stark reality that public consumption expenditure in the first half of the year of the pandemic has been less than what it was in 2019-20, a normal year. The existence of a public sector gives us a chance, provides us with the instrument to stabilize the economy from the natural shock. The macroeconomic consequences of disruption to economic activity and need for expansionary economic policy had been flagged by independent economists at the very onset of COVID-19. So what the editorial is trying to say, that public sector gives us a chance to stabilize the economy and take that shock, but the government has to rethink. Even the economists during the time of COVID-19 had said that expansionary economic policy has to be put, not contractionary. We had seen expansionary means increase in expenditure and reduce the taxes, but the government is doing the reverse. For fiscal policy in India to ignore that advisory and reduce spending when it most needs to stabilize the economy, it cannot be anyone's case that an economy should be run on public consumption permanently. The editorial is trying to say that yes, public consumption expenditure, that is the government's investments and expenditure, on this the whole economy cannot be run. However, maintaining it for a little longer could have checked the economic slide and its negative consequences. During the time of COVID, where demand needs to rise, the government has to come in with all these things. It would have been the fiscal responsibility or the fiscally responsible thing to do in the current scenario. Okay, so these are the editorials. We spoke about the UN AOC and 3 editorials on economics. First one being on the monetary policy of the RBI, second one unorganized sector, and the third one the fiscal responsibility of the government. Okay, so you can revise these editorials. Remember, the art and science of asking questions is source of all knowledge. Thank you.